The echo in the drain. The plumbing in an old mortuary has a language of its own, a series of gurgles and metallic groans that you eventually learn to ignore. I was working at a small, family-owned funeral home in the valley, a place where the wallpaper was peeling and the air always held a faint, cloying scent of lilies and formaldehyde. It was a Thursday night, and the rain was drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm against the high, frosted windows of the prep room. My task was a standard preparation for an elderly man, a former lighthouse keeper who had spent most of his life in solitude before passing away from a stroke. The room was silent except for the rain and the steady rhythmic splash of water against the stainless steel table. I was focused on the arterial injection, moving with a calm, mechanical purpose that comes from years of routine. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should, predictable and peaceful. But as I turned the faucet to rinse the table, the water didn't swirl down the drain. It pooled around the man's shoulders, rising slowly, turning a deep, murky gray. I reached for the drain cover, thinking it was just a clog of hair or surgical cotton. But as my fingers brushed the metal grate, the water began to vibrate. A sound started rising from deep within the pipes. Not a gurgle, but a low, wet whistling. It was the exact four-note melody I had heard the transport team humming earlier that afternoon. I pulled my hand back, but the water didn't recede. Instead, a pale, waterlogged finger began to poke upward through the narrow slits of the drain, followed by the sound of a voice whispering my own name from beneath the floorboards. I scrambled backward, my boots slipping on the wet tile. My heart felt like a trapped bird beating against my ribs, and my breath came in short, jagged gasps. The whispering didn't stop. It was a wet, raspy sound, like air being forced through fluid-filled lungs. "Arthur," the voice hissed again, the syllables bubbling through the rising water on the table. The man on the table remained perfectly still, his eyes closed, his face a mask of waxen peace. The finger sticking out of the drain began to move, beckoning, the skin so pruned and white, it looked like it had been submerged for weeks. I knew everybody in the building. There were only 3 in the coolers, and all of them were accounted for. There was no one else in the building. The doors were bolted from the inside, and the security alarm was set. Yet, the whistling continued, growing louder, echoing off the sterile walls until it felt like the very room was singing. I forced myself to walk back to the table, my hands shaking so violently I had to grip the edge of the steel to stay upright. I grabbed a pair of long forceps, my intent to push the finger back down, to prove to myself it was just a gruesome hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when the metal touched the flesh, the finger didn't retract. It gripped the forceps. The strength was immense, a cold, dead force that began to pull me toward the rising pool of gray water. I dropped the tools and ran. I didn't stop until I was out in the rain, my lungs burning, the cold water soaking through my scrubs. I stood in the parking lot for an hour, watching the windows of the prep room, waiting for a shadow to move. Nothing did. The next morning, I returned with the director. The prep room was bone dry. The water had drained perfectly, and the man on the table was exactly where I had left him, though the forceps were lying at the bottom of the sink, twisted into a shape no human hand should be able to make. We checked the pipes later that day, expecting to find a blockage or a backup from the storm. The plumber pulled out a small, heavy object that had been wedged in the U-bend. It was a brass nameplate from a casket, tarnished and worn by years of salt and water. The name etched into the metal wasn't the lighthouse keeper's. It was mine. I resigned that afternoon. Some people say the dead don't speak, that they leave their stories behind once the heart stops. But I know the truth. Sometimes the dead don't just watch, they call out, and sometimes they're calling for you. I still check the drains in my own home every night before I sleep, listening for the sound of a whistle rising through the pipes.